Welcome back. Tonight, we gently explore ancient Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization. Get comfortable and let the story begin. The dawn of settlement. In the beginning, there was the land between two rivers. The Greeks would later call it Mesopotamia, from their words mesos and potamos, meaning between rivers. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers flowed from the mountains in the north, carving their paths through vast plains before emptying into the Persian Gulf. This land, stretching across what is now Iraq and parts of Syria, Turkey, and Iran, would witness the birth of human civilization itself, long before the great cities rose from the earth. Before kings wore crowns and priests raised temples to the heavens, small bands of hunter-gatherers wandered these fertile plains. They followed the herds, gathered wild grains, and sought shelter in caves and temporary camps. But around 10,000 years before our Common Era, something remarkable began to happen. These nomadic peoples started to settle, to plant seeds, to domesticate animals, and to build permanent homes. The earliest settlements appeared in the northern regions of Mesopotamia, where rainfall was more abundant. Villages of mud brick houses emerged, their inhabitants learning to cultivate wheat and barley, to raise sheep and goats. They fashioned pottery from clay, wove textiles from wool and flax, and slowly, generation by generation, transformed from wanderers into farmers. The Ubaid period, the foundation. By the 6th millennium before the Common Era, a culture known to historians as the Ubaid period had spread across southern Mesopotamia. These were the true pioneers of civilization in the land between the rivers. The Ubaid people settled in the marshlands and river valleys of the south, where the soil was rich with silt deposited by the annual floods, but where rainfall was scarce and unpredictable. They faced a harsh environment. The southern plains baked under a merciless sun in summer, and the rivers could flood destructively in spring. There were no trees for timber, no stone for building. Yet the Ubaid people possessed ingenuity. They dug the first irrigation canals, channeling water from the rivers to their fields. They learned to bake mud bricks harder and stronger. They built their homes on raised platforms to escape the floods. The settlements grew. Eridu, perhaps the oldest city in the world, emerged near the shores of the Persian Gulf. Generation after generation built upon the same sacred ground, raising temples to their gods. Layer upon layer, the city grew upward, creating an artificial hill, a mound that would endure for millennia. In these early settlements, the seeds of civilization took root. People began to specialize in crafts. Some became skilled potters, creating vessels decorated with geometric patterns. Others became weavers, priests, or administrators. Trade networks stretched across the region, bringing obsidian from Anatolia, stones for tools, and exotic goods from distant lands. The Ubaid culture spread northward along the rivers, establishing settlements that would grow into mighty cities. The Uruk period, the first cities. Around 4,000 years before the Common Era, the pace of change accelerated. The settlement of Uruk, located along the Euphrates River in southern Mesopotamia, began its transformation into the world's first true city. Population grew rapidly as people migrated from smaller villages, drawn by opportunities and the protection of walls. Uruk expanded beyond anything seen before. At its height, during the 4th millennium, the city covered nearly 6 square kilometers and housed tens of thousands of inhabitants. Massive mud brick walls, later said to be the work of the hero king Gilgamesh, surrounded the urban core. Within these walls rose structures of unprecedented scale and ambition. The White Temple stood atop a raised platform, a ziggurat that lifted the sacred building toward the heavens. Priests climbed its stairs to perform rituals honoring An, the sky god. The temple complex controlled vast estates, employed hundreds of workers, and managed the distribution of grain and goods. In another quarter of the city, the Eanna temple complex honored Inanna, the goddess of love and war. with buildings decorated with thousands of clay cones pressed into walls to create colorful mosaics. With such complexity came the need for record-keeping. Temple administrators needed to track stores of grain, numbers of livestock, distributions of rations to workers, and tributes received from the surrounding countryside. Around 3,400 years before the Common Era, the Sumerians of Uruk invented writing. The earliest texts were not literature or laws, but accounting records. On small clay tablets, scribes used a reed stylus to press marks into the soft clay, creating wedge-shaped symbols. These cuneiform characters, as they would later be called, began as simple pictograms. A drawing of a sheep meant sheep, a drawing of grain meant grain. Over time, the system grew more sophisticated, evolving to represent sounds and abstract concepts. This invention changed everything. Knowledge could now be preserved beyond the limits of human memory. Laws could be written down, contracts could be recorded, and stories could be transmitted across generations without change. The scribal schools that emerged trained young men in the complex art of writing, creating a class of educated administrators who would serve kings and temples for millennia to come. The early dynastic period, the first kings. By 3,000 years before the Common Era, the southern plains of Mesopotamia, the land called Sumer, had become a patchwork of city-states. Each city was an independent kingdom, ruled by a king and dominated by temple complexes dedicated to patron deities. Uruk, Ur, Eridu, Lagash, Umma, Nippur, Kish, and dozens of other cities competed for resources, trade, and glory. The king lists, later compiled by scribes, named rulers who reigned for impossibly long periods in the distant past. These were the legendary kings, semi-divine figures said to have ruled before a great flood covered the earth. Then came the flood, and afterward, kingship descended from heaven once more. The early kings were both priest and warrior. They maintained the temples, led religious festivals, and commanded armies. They built defensive walls, dug irrigation canals, and judged disputes. The palace and the temple were the two great institutions of Sumerian society, sometimes cooperating, sometimes competing for power and resources. Warfare was frequent in this crowded land. City fought against city over water rights, over control of trade routes, over perceived insults and ancient grievances. Kings boasted of their victories in inscriptions carved into stone. One ruler of Lagash, named Eannatum, recorded his triumph over the neighboring city of Umma on a monument called the Stele of Vultures. The carved reliefs showed his soldiers marching in tight formation, their enemies fallen beneath their feet, their bodies left to be devoured by vultures. Yet life in these cities was not only about war. In the streets and squares, merchants sold grain, dates, fish, and textiles. Craftsmen worked copper and bronze into tools and weapons. Potters shaped clay vessels on their wheels. Women wove wool into fabric, grinding grain into flour, raising children. Slaves, captured in war or sold into bondage for debt, labored in fields and households. The Sumerians worshipped a pantheon of gods. An, the sky god, was the father of the gods. Enlil, the wind god, held supreme authority in the divine assembly. Enki, the water god, possessed wisdom and governed the subterranean freshwater ocean. Inanna, the goddess of love and war, inspired both passion and terror. Each city had its patron deity, whose temple formed the heart of urban life, the tale of Gilgamesh. In Uruk, there ruled a king whose name would echo through the ages, Gilgamesh. Later tradition remembered him as 2/3 god and 1/3 human, a giant of a man, strong beyond measure, but also arrogant and oppressive to his people. The gods, hearing the complaints of Uruk's citizens, created a wild man named Enkidu to challenge him. Enkidu lived among the animals, drinking with gazelles. running with the herds. He knew nothing of civilization until a temple woman was sent to civilize him. She shared her bed with him for 6 days and 7 nights, and afterward, the animals fled from him. She clothed him, fed him bread, gave him beer, and taught him to be human. She brought him to Uruk. When Enkidu and Gilgamesh met, they fought, 2 titans grappling in the streets. Neither could overcome the other, and from that contest emerged a friendship deeper than brotherhood. Together they ventured to the cedar forest to slay the terrible guardian Humbaba. Together they scorned the goddess Inanna when she proposed marriage to Gilgamesh, and together they killed the bull of heaven when the enraged goddess sent it against them. But the gods decreed that one must die for these offenses, and Enkidu fell ill. For 12 days he suffered, and then he died. Gilgamesh mourned his friend with terrible grief. He tore his hair, rent his clothes, wandered in the wilderness. The death of Enkidu awakened in Gilgamesh a desperate fear of his own mortality. Gilgamesh set out on a quest to find eternal life. He journeyed to the ends of the earth, crossed the waters of death, and found Utnapishtim, the sole survivor of the great flood, whom the gods had granted immortality. Utnapishtim told him the story of the flood, how Enki had warned him to build a boat, to take aboard his family and representatives of all living creatures, and how the waters had covered the earth for 7 days and nights. But when Gilgamesh asked for the secret of eternal life, Utnapishtim challenged him. If he sought immortality, let him first try to stay awake for 6 days and 7 nights. Gilgamesh tried, but he was only human, and sleep overtook him. He failed the test. Utnapishtim's wife took pity on him and revealed the existence of a plant at the bottom of the sea that could restore youth. Gilgamesh dove deep and grasped the thorny plant. On his journey home, Gilgamesh stopped at a pool of cool water. While he bathed, a serpent smelled the plant's fragrance, slithered up, and ate it, shedding its skin and slithering away renewed. Gilgamesh had lost his last chance at immortality. He returned to Uruk, empty-handed, but wiser. He looked upon the walls he had built, the great temples, the mighty city, and understood that this was the only immortality given to humans, the works they leave behind, the cities they build, the good they do for their people. The story of Gilgamesh would be copied and recopied for thousands of years, the world's first great work of literature. The Akkadian Empire, the first empire, around 2,334 years before the Common Era, a man of mysterious origin rose to power. His name was Sargon, and he would create the world's first empire. Later legend claimed he had been born in secret, placed by his mother in a reed basket, and set adrift on the Euphrates, where a gardener found and raised him. He entered the service of the king of Kish, rose to become cupbearer, and then seized power for himself. Sargon established his capital at Akkad, a city whose exact location remains unknown to this day. He was not content with ruling a single city. Sargon conquered Uruk, Ur, Lagash, and Umma. He marched his armies across all of Sumer, toppling the old kings. He pushed westward to the Mediterranean coast, northward into the mountains, eastward into Elam. Within a few years, Sargon had unified Mesopotamia under his rule. The Akkadians spoke a Semitic language different from Sumerian, but they adopted and adapted Sumerian cuneiform for writing their own tongue. Sargon appointed his daughter Enheduanna as high priestess of the moon god Nana at Ur, a position of immense religious and political importance. Enheduanna was herself a poet, composing hymns to Inanna that are among the earliest authored works in human history. Sargon's empire was held together by military force, by a network of governors loyal to him, and by the sheer force of his personality. His reign lasted 56 years, an extraordinary span. His grandsons continued his dynasty, but the empire faced constant rebellions. The Sumerian cities resented Akkadian rule. Mountain peoples raided from the east. The empire required constant military campaigns to maintain. Sargon's grandson Naram-Sin declared himself a god, writing his name with the divine determinative symbol, wearing the horned crown of divinity. He erected monuments celebrating his victories, including a famous stele showing him climbing a mountain, his enemies falling before him, trampling them underfoot as the stars of the gods looked down approvingly. But around 2,154 years before the Common Era, the Akkadian Empire collapsed. Climate change brought severe drought. The Gutians, a people from the Zagros Mountains, invaded and sacked Akkadian cities. The empire fragmented, and a dark age descended upon Mesopotamia for several generations. The Ur-III dynasty. Sumerian Renaissance. Order gradually returned. The city of Ur rose to dominance under a new dynasty, the Third Dynasty of Ur, beginning around 2,112 years before the Common Era. King Ur-Nammu and his son Shulgi rebuilt Mesopotamia, creating a centralized bureaucratic state more sophisticated than anything before it. Ur-Nammu is remembered for his law code, one of the earliest legal codes ever written. Unlike later Babylonian law, Ur-Nammu's code prescribed fines for most offenses rather than physical punishment. If a man cut off another's foot, he paid 10 shekels of silver. If he broke another's bone, he paid 1 mina of silver. The code regulated marriage, divorce, slavery, and property rights, establishing legal precedents that would influence Mesopotamian law for centuries. Ur-Nammu also commissioned the construction of great ziggurats across Mesopotamia. These massive step pyramids, built of mud brick, lifted temples toward the sky. The ziggurat of Ur, dedicated to the moon god Nanna, rose in 3 great terraces, its shrine at the summit reached by 3 staircases. These monuments were not tombs like the Egyptian pyramids, but sacred mountains, symbolic connections between earth and heaven. The Ur-III state was a marvel of organization. Tens of thousands of clay tablets recording administrative details have been recovered by archaeologists. Everything was counted, measured, recorded. Workers received rations of barley and oil, calculated precisely according to their age, sex, and occupation. Shepherds reported the number of lambs born in their flocks. Weavers recorded how much wool they processed. Tax collectors tallied grain from every field. This bureaucratic efficiency came at a cost. The state controlled labor on a massive scale. Workers, including large numbers of war captives, were assigned to work gangs, digging canals, building walls, harvesting fields. The level of control was oppressive, though effective. For a century, the Ur-III state maintained peace and prosperity across Mesopotamia, but the system was rigid, unable to adapt to crisis. Around 2,004 years before the Common Era, new invaders, the Elamites from the east and the Amorites from the west, attacked Mesopotamia. They sacked Ur, carrying away the last king in chains. A famous lamentation poem mourned the destruction of the city, describing the corpses in the streets, the burning of temples, the end of a world. The Old Babylonian period. Hammurabi's laws. The fall of Ur-III marked the beginning of a new period of fragmentation. Amorite chieftains established kingdoms across Mesopotamia. One of these Amorite dynasties established itself at Babylon, a city that had been relatively minor but was strategically located along the Euphrates in central Mesopotamia. For over a century, Babylon was just one kingdom among many, competing with Larsa, Isin, Eshnunna, Mari, and other city-states. Then, in 1792 years before the Common Era, a king named Hammurabi ascended the throne of Babylon. For the first 3 decades of his reign, Hammurabi was patient and cautious. He strengthened his kingdom, built up his army, forged alliances, and waited for his moment. The dominant power in southern Mesopotamia was Rim-Sin of Larsa, an old king who had ruled for 60 years. Hammurabi waited until Rimsin grew old and weak. Then, in a series of swift campaigns, Hammurabi struck. He betrayed his former allies one by one, conquering their kingdoms. He defeated Rimsin of Larsa and unified southern Mesopotamia. He marched north and conquered Mari, despite having been allied with its king. He pushed eastward and subjugated Eshnunna. Within a decade, Hammurabi had created an empire that stretched from the Persian Gulf to Assyria in the north. Hammurabi ruled for 43 years, and his letters reveal him as a hands-on administrator, concerned with the details of governance. He personally ordered the repair of irrigation canals, the appointment of officials, the resolution of legal disputes. He presented himself as a shepherd to his people, a just king who protected the weak from the strong. Hammurabi's most famous achievement is his law code, inscribed on a large black stele of basalt. At the top of the stele, a carved relief shows Hammurabi standing before Shamash, the sun god and god of justice, receiving the laws from the deity. Below this image are nearly 300 laws, written in the Old Babylonian dialect of Akkadian. The Code of Hammurabi was not the first law code, but it was the most complete and influential. The laws are arranged systematically, covering false accusations, theft, property damage, debt, marriage and family relations, assault, professional liability, trade, slavery, and many other topics. The prologue and epilogue frame the laws in poetic language, declaring that the gods chose Hammurabi to establish justice in the land. The principle often associated with Hammurabi's code is the law of retaliation, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But this principle applied only between social equals. Babylonian society was divided into 3 classes. The Awilum were free citizens of the upper class, including officials, priests, and merchants. The Mushkanim were free commoners, perhaps dependent on the palace or temple. The Wardum were slaves. If a member of the Awilum class destroyed the eye of another Awilum, his own eye would be destroyed. But if he destroyed the eye of a Mushkanim, he paid a fine of 1 mina of silver. If he destroyed the eye of a slave, he paid half the slave's value. The laws thus reinforced social hierarchy while attempting to regulate behavior and provide predictable consequences for actions. Other laws protected women's rights to property and divorce under certain circumstances, regulated adoption, set fees for physicians and builders, and provided rules for merchants and traders. The death penalty was prescribed for many offenses, including certain types of theft, false accusation of serious crimes, and adultery. The code also held builders and doctors accountable for their work. If a builder constructed a house that collapsed and killed the owner, the builder could be executed. The stele containing the Code of Hammurabi was erected in the Temple of Marduk in Babylon, where citizens could come and have it read to them. Copies were made and sent throughout the kingdom. The code remained influential long after Hammurabi's death. Scribes studied it for over 1,000 years, and elements of its principles influenced later law codes. Hammurabi died in 1750 years before the Common Era. His empire did not long survive him. His successors faced invasions and gradually lost control of the territories Hammurabi had conquered. Babylon itself remained important, but the empire fragmented. New powers rose in the north and east, the Kassites and the Middle Period. After Hammurabi's dynasty fell, Mesopotamia entered a period of upheaval. The Hittites from Anatolia raided and sacked Babylon itself in 1595 years before the Common Era. In the chaos that followed, a people called the Kassites, whose origins remain mysterious, gradually gained control of Babylonia. The Kassites ruled Babylon for over 4 centuries, the longest-lasting dynasty in Babylonian history. They adopted Babylonian culture, speaking Akkadian, worshipping Babylonian gods, continuing Babylonian administrative traditions. Under Kassite rule, Babylon remained an important cultural and religious center, though not a major political power. In northern Mesopotamia, the Mitanni kingdom dominated for a time, controlling a vast region from Syria to Assyria. The Mitanni were Indo-Aryan rulers over a predominantly Hurrian population. They trained horses, developed chariot warfare, and built a powerful kingdom. But the Mitanni faced pressure from multiple directions. From the west, the Hittites pushed eastward from their Anatolian homeland. From the east, the Assyrians, who had long been subjects or allies of Mitanni, began to assert independence. The rise of Assyria. The Middle Assyrian period. The city of Ashur, located on the Tigris River in northern Mesopotamia, had been an important trade center for over 1,000 years. Its merchants had established trading colonies in Anatolia during the early second millennium, but Ashur had usually been subordinate to more powerful neighbors. Around 1,365 years before the Common Era, King Ashur-uballit I declared Assyrian independence from Mitanni and began expanding Assyrian territory. He and his successors conquered the lands of the crumbling Mitanni kingdom, pushed into Syria, and even briefly controlled Babylon. The Middle Assyrian kings were warriors. Shalmaneser I conquered territories across northern Mesopotamia. Tukulti-Ninurta, I defeated Babylon and carried away the statue of Marduk, Babylon's patron god. To Assyria, an act of supreme sacrilege that shocked the ancient world. He built a new capital across the Tigris from Ashur and named it after himself. But the Middle Assyrian Empire was not stable. Kings were frequently assassinated in palace coups. The empire expanded and contracted with each reign. When strong kings ruled, Assyria dominated its neighbors. When weak kings or internal conflicts weakened the state, territories broke away. Tiglath-Pileser I, who ruled in the late 12th century, revived Assyrian power. He campaigned in all directions, reaching as far as the Mediterranean coast. His annals boast of conquering 42 lands and kings. He hunted lions and captured elephants. He established a library at Ashur, collecting texts from conquered territories. But after Tiglath-Pileser's death, Assyria entered a period of decline. Aramean tribes, nomadic peoples from the Syrian desert, migrated into Mesopotamia, disrupting trade and communications. For several centuries, Assyria struggled merely to survive. The Neo-Assyrian Empire. The rise of the war machine. Around 911 years before the Common Era, the Assyrian kings began a systematic recovery. Adad-nirari II stabilized the kingdom and pushed back against the Aramean tribes. His successors resumed territorial expansion. Ashur-nasirpal II, who ruled from 883 to 859 years before the Common Era, was a king of terrible reputation. His annals describe in graphic detail the punishments he inflicted on rebels and enemies. He had prisoners impaled on stakes around city walls. He burned captives alive. He flayed the skin from those who resisted. He cut off ears, noses, hands. These brutal tactics were not mere cruelty, but calculated psychological warfare, designed to terrify enemies into submission without fighting. Ashur-nasir-pal moved the Assyrian capital to Kalhu, which the Greeks would later call Nimrud. He built a massive palace decorated with colossal stone sculptures of human-headed winged bulls, protective genies that guarded gates and doorways. The palace walls were carved with relief sculptures showing the king hunting lions, besieging cities, receiving tribute, and defeating enemies. The Assyrian army became the most formidable military force the ancient world had yet seen. It was a professional, standing army rather than a militia of farmers called up for campaigns. The soldiers were full-time warriors, rigorously trained, equipped with iron weapons and armor. The army included specialized units: archers, spearmen, cavalry, charioteers, siege engineers. The Assyrians developed sophisticated siege warfare techniques. They built massive siege towers on wheels that could be rolled up to city walls. They used battering rams with iron heads to break through gates and walls. They dug tunnels under fortifications. They built earthen ramps to reach the top of walls. Few cities could withstand an Assyrian siege for long. The empire expanded relentlessly. Shalmaneser III, Ashur-nasir-pal's son, campaigned every year of his long reign, pushing into Syria, fighting against the kingdom of Urartu in the north, battling coalitions of Syrian and Palestinian kings. His annals record a battle at Karkar in 853 years before the Common Era, where he faced a coalition that included King Ahab of Israel. The battle was costly, and Shalmaneser did not achieve his objectives, but he claimed victory nonetheless. The Assyrians developed a policy of mass deportation. When they conquered a region, they would relocate large portions of the population to other parts of the empire. This served multiple purposes. It broke up ethnic and political unity in conquered regions, making rebellion more difficult. It provided labor for Assyrian construction projects and agricultural development. It mixed populations throughout the empire, gradually creating a more homogeneous imperial culture. Tens of thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands, of people were deported during Assyrian campaigns. Families were torn apart. Ancient communities were dispersed. The policy caused immense suffering, but it also spread technologies, ideas, and cultural practices across the Near East. The height of Assyrian power, Sargon II and Sennacherib, after a period of weakness in the late 8th century, when internal conflicts and external pressures nearly destroyed the empire, Assyria experienced a dramatic revival under a new dynasty. A general named Sargon seized the throne in 722 years before the Common Era, adopting the name of the ancient empire builder. Sargon II reconquered lost territories and expanded the empire to its greatest extent. He defeated the kingdom of Urartu in the north. He completed the conquest of Israel, deporting its population and resettling the land with peoples from other parts of the empire, the origin of the later Samaritan community. He campaigned in Syria, Anatolia, and Iran. He defeated Babylon and Elam in the south and east. Sargon built a new capital city called Dur-Sharuken, Fortress of Sargon, near modern Khorsabad. The city was a masterpiece of urban planning, with massive walls, monumental gates, temples, palaces, and administrative buildings. The palace was decorated with miles of carved relief sculptures showing the king's military victories, hunting scenes, and processions of tribute bearers. But Sargon's reign ended mysteriously. He died in battle around 705 years before the Common Era, apparently fighting against the Sumerians. His body was never recovered, which was seen as a terrible omen. His new capital was abandoned, as though cursed. Sargon's son, Sennacherib, moved the capital to Nineveh, an ancient city on the Tigris River. He transformed Nineveh into one of the grandest cities of the ancient world. He expanded the city walls to enclose 7.5 kilometers of land with 15 massive gates. He built the palace without rival, decorated with thousands of meters of carved relief sculptures. Sennacherib was an innovative builder. He created parks and gardens, including elaborate water systems that brought water from distant mountains through aqueducts and canals. Some scholars have suggested that these gardens, rather than those of Babylon, were the famous Hanging Gardens, later attributed to Nebuchadnezzar through a confusion of sources. Sennacherib faced a constant problem: Babylon. The ancient and prestigious city repeatedly rebelled against Assyrian rule. Sennacherib tried various approaches, installing puppet kings, deporting populations, rebuilding temples. Nothing worked. Finally, in 689 years before the Common Era, Sennacherib did the unthinkable. He sacked Babylon, looted its temples, and carried away the statue of Marduk. He diverted canals to flood the city ruins, attempting to destroy it completely. The destruction of Babylon shocked the entire Near East. It was a sacrilegious act against one of the world's most sacred cities. Many Assyrians themselves were horrified. The act would cast a shadow over the remainder of Sennacherib's reign. In 681 years before the Common Era, Sennacherib was assassinated by his own sons in the temple of Nisroch. His favorite son, Esarhaddon, who had been in exile, rushed back to Nineveh, defeated his brothers, and claimed the throne. Esarhaddon and the conquest of Egypt. Esarhaddon faced the task of restoring order and legitimacy to the Assyrian throne. He rebuilt Babylon, which his father had destroyed, restoring its temples and its statue of Marduk. This act of piety helped heal the rift his father's sacrilege had created. Esarhaddon also launched one of the most ambitious military campaigns in Assyrian history, the conquest of Egypt. Egypt, under the rule of the Kushite dynasty of the 25th dynasty, had been supporting Syrian and Palestinian rebellions against Assyria. Esarhaddon decided to strike at the source. In 671 years before the Common Era, the Assyrian army marched across the Sinai Desert, a logistical feat of extraordinary difficulty. They invaded Egypt and captured Memphis, the ancient capital. Pharaoh Taharka fled south to Thebes. Esarhaddon proclaimed himself king of Egypt and king of Cush, adding these ancient titles to his titulary. The conquest was not stable. Taharka returned and reconquered Egypt. Esarhaddon was preparing a second campaign when he died in 669 years before the Common Era, while marching toward Egypt. Ashurbanipal, the last great king. Esarhaddon's son Ashurbanipal became king in 668 years before the Common Era. He would be the last great king of Assyria. Ashurbanipal immediately launched a campaign to reconquer Egypt. His armies defeated Taharka, drove south to Thebes, and sacked that ancient city. Egypt was briefly brought back under Assyrian control, though local princes soon reasserted independence. Ashurbanipal is remembered not only as a warrior but as a scholar king. He established a great library at Nineveh, sending scribes throughout his empire to copy texts from temple libraries and archives. They collected thousands of tablets, literary works, historical texts, astronomical observations, medical treatises, omens, prayers, and myths. Among the treasures of this library were copies of the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Enuma Elish creation epic, and countless other works of Mesopotamian literature. When archaeologists excavated Nineveh in the 19th century, they discovered the remains of Ashurbanipal's library over 30,000 clay tablets and fragments. This discovery revolutionized our understanding of ancient Mesopotamia. Much of what we know about Sumerian and Babylonian literature, history, and science comes from copies preserved in Ashurbanipal's library. Ashurbanipal's reign also witnessed bitter family conflict. His brother Shamash, Shumukin, whom Esarhaddon had installed as king of Babylon, rebelled against Ashurbanipal's overlordship. A civil war erupted that lasted 4 years, devastating Babylonia. Ashurbanipal besieged Babylon, and Shamash Shumukin died in the flames of his burning palace in 648 years before the Common Era. Ashurbanipal also waged a terrible war against Elam. The Elamite kingdom, based in southwestern Iran, had long been an enemy of both Assyria and Babylon. Ashurbanipal destroyed Elam's capital Susa in 639 years before the Common Era, carrying away its treasures and deporting its population. Elam never recovered. At the height of his power, Ashurbanipal controlled an empire stretching from Egypt to the Persian Gulf, from the Mediterranean to the Zagros Mountains. It was the largest empire the world had yet seen. But the empire was exhausted. Decades of continuous warfare had drained resources. The massive deportations had disrupted economies. The army was overstretched, trying to garrison and control vast territories. Resentment smoldered among subject peoples. Ashurbanipal died around 627 years before the Common Era. After his death, the Assyrian Empire rapidly unraveled. The fall of Assyria. Within 14 years of Ashurbanipal's death, the Assyrian Empire collapsed completely. The Assyrian chronicles, which had recorded events for centuries, end abruptly. What happened? First, Assyria was torn by internal conflicts. Ashurbanipal's successors fought for the throne. The government weakened. The army's loyalty fractured. Second, new enemies emerged. The Medes, an Indo-Iranian people from western Iran, were unifying under their king, Cyaxares. They had learned Assyrian military techniques and forged them into a powerful army. The Medes wanted revenge for Assyrian invasions of their lands. Third, Babylon rebelled once more. In 626 years before the Common Era, a Chaldean chieftain named Nabopolassar seized control of Babylon and declared independence from Assyria. Over the next decade, he fought to expel Assyrian forces from Babylonia. In 615 years before the Common Era, the Medes invaded Assyria from the east. They captured and sacked the religious capital of Ashur, the ancient heart of Assyria. The city was destroyed, its temples burned. In 614 years before the Common Era, Nabopolassar and Cyaxares formed a formal alliance. According to tradition, the alliance was sealed by a marriage. Nabopolassar's son Nebuchadnezzar married Amytis, daughter of Cyaxares. In 612 years before the Common Era, the allied armies of Babylon, the Medes, and other peoples besieged Nineveh. For 3 months, the great city held out. But in the summer, the attackers breached the walls. The city fell. King Sin-shar-ishkin died, possibly by his own hand, in the flames of his palace. Nineveh, the greatest city of its age, was thoroughly sacked, burned, and destroyed. The destruction was total. The palaces and temples were looted and burned. The massive walls were pulled down. The city was abandoned. A prophetic book from the Hebrew Bible, the Book of Nahum, celebrated the fall of Nineveh with savage poetry, calling it the city of blood and describing its destruction as divine justice. Remnants of the Assyrian army retreated westward to Haran. There, the last Assyrian king, Ashur-uballit II, tried to maintain a rump state. But Haran fell to the Babylonians in 609 years before the Common Era, the Assyrian Empire, which had dominated the Near East for centuries, vanished from history. The Neo-Babylonian Empire, Nabopolassar and Nebuchadnezzar. With Assyria destroyed, Babylon emerged as the dominant power in Mesopotamia. Nabopolassar, the founder of the Neo-Babylonian or Chaldean dynasty, spent the remainder of his reign consolidating control over the former Assyrian territories in Syria and Palestine. Egypt, under Pharaoh Necho II, tried to take advantage of the power vacuum. In 609 years before the Common Era, the Egyptian army marched north to support the Assyrian remnant at Haran. They arrived too late to save the city, but occupied much of Syria and Palestine. Nabopolassar sent his son Nebuchadnezzar to drive out the Egyptians. At Carchemish, in 605 years before the Common Era, Nebuchadnezzar won a decisive victory, destroying the Egyptian army. He pursued the fleeing Egyptians southward, conquering Syria and Palestine. He was preparing to invade Egypt itself when news arrived. Nabopolassar had died. Nebuchadnezzar rushed back to Babylon to claim the throne. Nebuchadnezzar II ruled Babylon for 43 years, from 605 to 562 years before the Common Era. He would become the most famous king of Babylon, remembered for his military conquests, his magnificent building projects, and his role in biblical history. Nebuchadnezzar campaigned regularly to maintain control of his empire. The Levantine kingdoms repeatedly rebelled, encouraged by Egypt. Each time, Nebuchadnezzar marched westward to reimpose control. The kingdom of Judah, a small state in the southern Levant, rebelled twice. After the first rebellion, Nebuchadnezzar captured Jerusalem in 597 years before the Common Era, deported King Jehoiachin and thousands of Judah's elite to Babylon, and installed a puppet king. When Judah rebelled again, Nebuchadnezzar's patience ended. In 586 years before the Common Era, after a siege lasting over a year, Jerusalem fell. The Babylonian army destroyed the city, including Solomon's temple, the center of Jewish religious life. The puppet king Zedekiah tried to flee but was captured. He was forced to watch as his sons were executed before him, and then his eyes were put out. He was carried in chains to Babylon. Much of the population of Judah was deported to Babylonia. This was the Babylonian exile, a traumatic event that profoundly shaped Jewish religion and identity. But Nebuchadnezzar was not only a conqueror. He was a builder on a scale that rivaled any king before him. He devoted enormous resources to restoring and expanding Babylon, transforming it into the most magnificent city of the ancient world. The city of Babylon had existed for nearly 2,000 years, but Nebuchadnezzar rebuilt it completely. He constructed massive defensive walls. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing over a century later, claimed the walls were so thick that a 4-horse chariot could turn on top of them. The walls enclosed over 800 hectares. 8 massive gates pierced the walls, each named for a god. The Ishtar Gate was the most splendid. It was decorated with hundreds of glazed brick reliefs showing bulls and dragons, the sacred animals of Marduk. Bright blue glazed bricks covered the gate, creating a stunning visual effect. From the Ishtar Gate, the processional way ran through the city, its walls also decorated with glazed brick reliefs of lions. Nebuchadnezzar constructed temples to all the major gods. The temple complex of Marduk, Babylon's patron deity, dominated the city. Within this complex stood Esagila, the great temple, and the massive ziggurat Etemenanki, the house of the foundation of heaven and earth. This ziggurat, rising in 7 stages to a height of perhaps 90 meters, may have been the inspiration for the biblical story of the Tower of Babel. Nebuchadnezzar also built palaces for himself. His main palace complex covered several hectares, with throne rooms, audience halls, residences, and administrative buildings. The throne room was particularly magnificent, decorated with glazed brick reliefs showing lions, bulls, and dragons. Later, Greek writers attributed to Nebuchadnezzar another marvel, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. According to legend, Nebuchadnezzar built these terraced gardens for his Median wife Amytis, who missed the green hills of her homeland. The gardens supposedly featured exotic trees and plants, irrigated by a sophisticated system that drew water from the Euphrates. However, no contemporary Babylonian text mentions the Hanging Gardens. Nebuchadnezzar's own inscriptions, which detail his building projects extensively, say nothing about them. Archaeologists have found no clear evidence of their existence. Some scholars believe the gardens were located at Nineveh, built by Sennacherib, and later mistakenly attributed to Nebuchadnezzar. Others believe they may have been pure legend. Regardless, Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar was undeniably magnificent. Visitors from throughout the known world came to marvel at the city. It was a cosmopolitan metropolis, home to people from many nations, including the exiled Jews, who maintained their identity and religious practices in the foreign land. Nebuchadnezzar also supported scholarship. Babylonian priests continued to make astronomical observations, recording the movements of planets and stars with remarkable precision. These observations would later influence Greek astronomy. Babylonian mathematics reached sophisticated levels. Scribes copied and studied ancient texts, preserving the literary heritage of Mesopotamia. The biblical Nebuchadnezzar. The Hebrew Bible presents a complex portrait of Nebuchadnezzar. He is the destroyer of Jerusalem, the oppressor of God's people, a symbol of worldly power opposed to divine will. Yet he is also presented as an instrument of God's judgment against Judah's sins. The book of Daniel, part of which is set during the Babylonian exile, tells strange stories about Nebuchadnezzar. In one tale, Nebuchadnezzar erected a golden statue and commanded all his subjects to worship it. 3 Jewish youths, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, refused. They were thrown into a blazing furnace, but emerged unharmed, causing Nebuchadnezzar to acknowledge the power of their God. In another story, Nebuchadnezzar had a disturbing dream that his wise men could not interpret. Daniel, one of the exiled Jews, interpreted the dream. It showed a great statue made of different materials: gold, silver, bronze, iron, and clay, representing successive kingdoms. A stone cut without hands struck the statue and destroyed it. Daniel explained that Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom was the golden head, but other kingdoms would follow, until eventually God's kingdom would destroy all earthly kingdoms. Later, the book tells that Nebuchadnezzar had another dream, this time of a great tree that was cut down. Daniel interpreted this as a warning that Nebuchadnezzar would be humbled. The king ignored the warning, and one day, while boasting of his achievements, he suddenly lost his reason. He was driven from human society and lived like an animal, eating grass, his hair and nails growing long. After 7 years, his sanity returned, and he acknowledged God's sovereignty. These are religious stories, not historical records, but they reflect how the Jewish exiles understood their situation, subject to a powerful king, yet believing that their God remained supreme, that earthly powers would fall, and that faithfulness would ultimately be vindicated. The fall of Babylon. Nabonidus and Belshazzar. Nebuchadnezzar died in 562 years before the Common Era. His son Amel-Marduk succeeded him, but was assassinated after only 2 years. Neriglissar, possibly his brother-in-law, seized the throne and ruled for 4 years before dying. Neriglissar's son reigned for only 9 months before being deposed and killed in a coup. In 556 years before the Common Era, an official named Nabonidus became king. He was not of the royal line, but may have been related to the family by marriage. Nabonidus was an unusual king. He was deeply religious, but his religious interests centered on the moon god, Sin rather than Marduk, Babylon's patron deity. Nabonidus undertook campaigns to the west, conquering the Arabian oasis city of Tama. Then he did something unprecedented. He moved to Tama and stayed there for 10 years, leaving Babylon to be governed by his son Belshazzar. Why Nabonidus abandoned Babylon remains mysterious. Some historians suggest he was troubled by religious disputes with the Marduk priesthood. Others propose he was trying to control trade routes through Arabia. Still others suggest he was eccentric or mentally unstable. Contemporary texts are ambiguous and politically motivated. Whatever the reason, Nabonidus' absence created instability. The Marduk priesthood, resentful of his preference for sin, undermined his legitimacy. The traditional New Year festival, which required the king's participation, could not be properly celebrated. Meanwhile, a new power was rising in the east. The Persian king Cyrus II had unified the Persian and Median kingdoms, conquered Lydia and Anatolia, and was building an empire. In 539 years before the Common Era, Cyrus turned his attention toward Babylonia. The Persian army advanced rapidly. Nabonidus hurried back to Babylon from Arabia, but it was too late. The Babylonian army was defeated. In October, 539 years before the Common Era, the Persians entered Babylon without a battle. The city opened its gates. Nabonidus was captured. Belshazzar may have died in the brief fighting. The Book of Daniel dramatically reimagines this event. It tells that Belshazzar held a great feast, drinking from sacred vessels looted from the Jerusalem temple. A disembodied hand appeared and wrote mysterious words on the wall. Many, many tekel upharsin. Daniel was summoned and interpreted. God has numbered your kingdom and brought it to an end. You have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. That very night, the story says, Belshazzar was killed, and Darius the Mede took the kingdom. The historical reality was less dramatic, but equally momentous. Babylon, the last great native Mesopotamian kingdom, had fallen to foreign conquest. The age of independent Mesopotamian civilization was ending. Cyrus, in Persian rule, Cyrus II entered Babylon and was proclaimed king. He presented himself as a liberator rather than a conqueror. The Cyrus cylinder, a clay inscription from his reign, declares that Marduk, angry at Nabonidus' impiety, had chosen Cyrus to rule Babylon. Cyrus claimed to have restored proper worship, repatriated displaced peoples, and ruled with justice. Unlike the Assyrians and Babylonians, who often destroyed, conquered peoples' temples, and deported populations, Cyrus practiced a policy of religious tolerance. He allowed subject peoples to maintain their own religions and customs, as long as they paid tribute and remained loyal. In 538 years before the Common Era, Cyrus issued an edict allowing the exiled Jews to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple. This decree, recorded in the biblical books of Ezra and Nehemiah, was part of his broader policy. Many Jews did return, though many others had established lives in Babylonia and chose to remain. Under Persian rule, Mesopotamia became a satrapy, a province of the vast Persian Empire. The region remained wealthy and important, but political power had shifted. The Achaemenid Persian kings ruled from Persepolis and Susa in Iran, not from Babylon or Nineveh. Babylon remained a major city. Persian kings maintained palaces there and sometimes resided in the city. The ancient temples continued to function, though gradually declining. Cuneiform continued to be written, and ancient texts continued to be copied and studied. Babylonian astronomy and mathematics continued to develop, reaching their highest levels of sophistication under Persian and later Greek rule. But Mesopotamia was no longer the center of the world. That honor now belonged to Persia, and later to other powers, Alexander and the Hellenistic period. In 331 years before the Common Era, Alexander the Great invaded the Persian Empire. The young Macedonian king had already defeated the Persians in 2 major battles. Now, he marched into the heart of the empire. Babylon surrendered to Alexander without resistance. Alexander entered the city in triumph. He ordered the restoration of Esagila, Marduk's temple, which had fallen into disrepair. He planned to make Babylon one of the capitals of his empire. Alexander marched eastward, conquering the remainder of the Persian Empire, reaching as far as India. But in 323 years before the Common Era, he died in Babylon, in Nebuchadnezzar's palace, at the age of 32. His empire immediately began to fragment as his generals fought for control. Mesopotamia eventually fell to Seleucus I, one of Alexander's generals, who founded the Seleucid Empire. The Seleucids were Greek in culture and language. They founded new cities, including Seleucia on the Tigris, near Babylon. Greek gradually replaced Akkadian as the language of administration and culture. Babylon declined under Seleucid rule. Its population dwindled as people moved to newer cities. The ancient temples were gradually abandoned. Cuneiform writing, which had been used for over 3,000 years, was eventually forgotten. The last known cuneiform tablet dates to 75 years into the Common Era, an astronomical text. By the time of the Roman Empire, Babylon was largely abandoned, a ruin in the desert. Greek and Roman travelers visited it and marveled at its massive walls and the remains of its ziggurat, but the city was dead. The Parthians and Sasanians. After the Seleucid period, Mesopotamia was ruled by the Parthian Empire, a dynasty that originated in northeastern Iran. The Parthians maintained control of Mesopotamia for nearly 5 centuries, from the mid-2nd century before the Common Era to the early 3rd century of the Common Era. Under Parthian rule, Mesopotamia was a frontier region, contested between the Parthian Empire and the Roman Empire. Cities like Ctesiphon, the Parthian capital located on the Tigris, grew in importance. But much of the ancient Mesopotamian culture had faded. The old gods were no longer widely worshipped. The old languages were no longer spoken or written. In 224 of the Common Era, the Sasanian dynasty overthrew the Parthians and established a new Persian empire. Ctesiphon remained the capital, and Mesopotamia remained an important region. But it was thoroughly Persianized, and the ancient Mesopotamian civilization was long gone. The Islamic conquest and the legacy. In the 7th century of the Common Era, Arab armies erupted from the Arabian Peninsula, united under the banner of Islam. They conquered the Sasanian Empire with remarkable speed. By 651, the conquest was complete. Mesopotamia became part of the Islamic world. The region, now called Iraq in Arabic, experienced a cultural and economic revival under the early Islamic caliphates. In 762, the Abbasid Caliph al-Mansur founded a new capital at Baghdad, not far from the site of ancient Babylon. Baghdad became one of the greatest cities in the world, a center of learning, trade, and culture during the Islamic Golden Age. But the ancient Mesopotamian civilization was forgotten. The great cities lay buried under desert sands and accumulating dirt. The languages were dead. The cuneiform script could not be read. The stories and histories survived only fragmentarily, preserved in the writings of Greek and Roman authors and in the Hebrew Bible, which transmitted, edited, and religiously interpreted versions of Mesopotamian traditions. For over 1,000 years, Mesopotamia's glory was forgotten. The ruined mounds that dotted the Iraqi landscape were nameless. Local people avoided them, believing them to be haunted. No one remembered that beneath these mounds lay Uruk, Ur, Babylon, Nineveh, and Ashur. Rediscovery. The archaeologists. In the 19th century, European travelers and archaeologists began to explore the ruins of Mesopotamia. They were drawn by biblical references to places like Babylon and Nineveh. What they discovered exceeded their wildest expectations. In the 1,840 seconds, Paul, Emile Botta, and Austin Henry Layard excavated the Assyrian palaces at Horsabad and Nineveh. They uncovered massive stone sculptures of human-headed winged bulls, relief carvings depicting Assyrian kings and their conquests, and thousands of cuneiform tablets. The artifacts were shipped to European museums, the British Museum in London, the Louvre in Paris. The public was amazed by these remnants of forgotten civilizations. The massive Assyrian sculptures, installed in museum halls, became instant sensations. But the cuneiform tablets remained unreadable. The script was mysterious, the languages unknown. Scholars worked for decades to decipher them. The breakthrough came through the Behistun inscription, a multilingual text carved on a cliff face in Iran by the Persian king Darius I. The inscription was written in Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian. Scholars used their knowledge of Old Persian to crack the code of Babylonian cuneiform. Once the script could be read, the tablets began to reveal their secrets. There were king lists, law codes, business records, letters, prayers, myths, and literary works. The Epic of Gilgamesh, translated in the 1,870 seconds, caused a sensation because it contained a flood story similar to the biblical account of Noah. Excavations continued. Gertrude Bell, Leonard Woolley, and other archaeologists excavated Ur, discovering the royal tombs with their extraordinary grave goods. German archaeologists excavated Babylon, partially reconstructing the Ishtar Gate and the processional way. French archaeologists excavated Mari, finding a palace archive of over 25,000 tablets. Throughout the 20th and into the 21st century, archaeological work continued, gradually revealing the full scope and complexity of Mesopotamian civilization. Each excavation, each translated tablet, added to our understanding. The legacy of Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia's legacy to human civilization is immeasurable. The Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians, and Assyrians created the foundations of civilization itself. They invented writing, initially for practical purposes of administration, but ultimately enabling the preservation and transmission of knowledge, literature, and law. The cuneiform script was adapted to write many different languages and remained in use for 3,000 years. They invented the wheel, revolutionizing transportation and pottery production. They developed sophisticated mathematics, including a sexagesimal number system that survives in our division of hours into 60 minutes and circles into 360 degrees. They created the first cities with all the social complexity that urban life entails. They developed organized religion with temples, priesthoods, and elaborate mythologies. They created the first law codes, attempting to regulate society through written rules rather than mere custom. They built the first empires, developing techniques of administration, taxation, and military organization that would influence all subsequent empires. They developed astronomy, making precise observations and calculations that would influence Greek and Islamic astronomy. Their literature influenced the Bible and, through it, Western culture, the biblical creation story, the flood narrative, legal traditions, psalms, and proverbs all show Mesopotamian influence. The Garden of Eden is placed in Mesopotamia, between the Tigris and Euphrates. The Tower of Babel is Babylon's ziggurat. Their architectural innovations, the arch, the vault, the ziggurat, influenced later architecture throughout the Near East and beyond. Even their mistakes and cruelties offer lessons. The Assyrian Empire's brutality and the Babylonian deportations demonstrate the human capacity for organized violence. The environmental degradation caused by intensive irrigation, salinization of soil, erosion, shows the potential consequences of unsustainable agricultural practices. The land today. Modern Iraq, which encompasses much of ancient Mesopotamia, has had a troubled history. The region has experienced wars, invasions, and instability. Archaeological sites have sometimes been damaged or looted. The Iraq War that began in 2003 resulted in looting of the National Museum of Iraq in Baghdad, though many stolen artifacts were later recovered. Yet the land retains traces of its ancient glory. The ruins of Babylon, partially reconstructed in the 20th century, still stand. The ziggurat of Ur, though eroded by millennia of wind and weather, still rises from the desert. The great winged bulls of Nineveh still guard museum halls in London, Paris, and elsewhere, silent witnesses to a vanished empire. Archaeological work continues when security conditions permit. New discoveries are still being made. Tablets are still being translated. Our understanding of Mesopotamian civilization continues to deepen and evolve. The rivers still flow, as they have for millions of years. The Tigris and Euphrates still bring water from the northern mountains to the southern plains. The land that gave birth to civilization endures, carrying within its soil the memories of the first cities, the first empires, the first writing. Epilogue. The eternal voices. In the cool halls of museums, in climate-controlled archives, in the libraries of universities, thousands upon thousands of clay tablets sit on shelves. They are brown or gray, covered with tiny wedge-shaped marks. To the untrained eye, they are merely curious artifacts, but to those who can read them, they are voices from the distant past. They speak of loves and losses, of business deals and broken contracts, of prayers offered and hopes disappointed. They tell of kings who boasted of their conquests and scribes who copied ancient texts. They preserve myths that tried to explain the creation of the world and the meaning of death. A merchant in Ur, 4,000 years ago, recorded a shipment of copper. A student in Nippur laboriously copied proverbs as a writing exercise. A priest in Babylon observed the position of Venus and recorded it for posterity. A scribe in Nineveh copied the Epic of Gilgamesh in beautiful handwriting. A lawyer in Larsa wrote out a contract for the sale of a field. A woman in Sippar complained to the authorities about her husband. These people lived and died millennia ago. Their bodies returned to dust long ago. The cities they knew are ruins. The languages they spoke are no longer heard. The gods they worshipped have no more worshippers. Yet their words remain, pressed into clay, baked hard by time or by the fires that destroyed their cities. Through these words, they still speak to us. They tell us that they were human, like us. They had families they loved, work they took pride in, gods they worshipped, fears they struggled with, dreams they pursued. The civilization of Mesopotamia rose from the mud of the river plains. For 3,000 years, it flourished. It created wonders. It produced great kings and humble scribes, mighty warriors and wise priests, poets and mathematicians, architects and astronomers. It fell to invaders and was forgotten, buried under desert sands. But it has been rediscovered. Its voices have been heard again. And its legacy endures in every city we build, every law we write, every story we tell, every wheel that turns. In the beginning, there was the land between two rivers. From that land came civilization. And though that civilization has passed away, though its cities are ruins and its languages are dead, its spirit lives on in everything humanity has built since. The rivers still flow, the sun still rises over the plains, and the ancient voices, pressed into clay, still whisper their eternal truth. We were here. We lived. We mattered. Remember us. Thus ends the Chronicle of Mesopotamia, the first civilization, the cradle of human culture, the land where history began. Thank you for joining this gentle trip into ancient Mesopotamia. If you enjoyed this slow and peaceful journey, feel free to return any time for more calming history stories. Until next time, sleep well and good night.